The smoke had not yet cleared when he crouched beside the body and picked up the dead man's papers. The railway car had been torn open by the blast. One wall was peeled back at the seam, and ash drifted in from the gap where the window had been. Around him on the buckled floor, across collapsed seats, an overturned luggage rack, the wreckage of a service cart that had once held hot drinks, were the people who had not survived the explosion. A few still breathed. Most had gone very quiet. The man doing the crouching paid attention to none of them. He was reading the documents. The name printed across the appointment letter was Ludger Chelsea, 26 years old, fallen noble, newly appointed professor at Sarin Academy, the most prestigious institution of magical learning in the Axilian Empire. The position came with a 2-year contract, campus housing, a research stipend, a furnished office, and a salary that would have made most working mages silently envious. Ludger Chelsea had earned none of it yet. He would not get the chance. He had died approximately 6 minutes ago in the same explosion that had scattered the rest of this carriage across the floor. The man holding his papers was 27 years old and had not used his real name in longer than it was useful to count. He had lived as a beast hunter, a professional thief, a criminal consultant with a reputation in certain circles for solving the kind of problems that law enforcement refused to touch, a figure from a civil war that 2 governments had quietly agreed not to document. Other names besides. Each identity built with care, maintained with care, and abandoned when the time demanded it. He read the papers again. 2 years. A contract. A reason to be in the city of Letterbell without raising suspicion. A false identity that someone else had already constructed. He would learn the shape of that construction later, and what he learned would complicate everything. The man named Ludger Chelsea had no further use for any of it. The man crouching in the ash slid the papers into his jacket and stood up. Somewhere outside, a woman in a military uniform was organizing the survivors. He had roughly 60 seconds before her sweep reached him. He arranged his expression into the specific quality of shock that sat just beneath numbness, the look of a young man who had barely survived something catastrophic while the person beside him had not. It was not entirely a performance. But to understand what it meant for him to walk through those academy gates under a borrowed name, to understand what he was carrying, what he was building, and what he would do to anyone who threatened the people he had chosen to protect, you need to go back further than this wreckage. You need to know who he actually was. His real name was Radcliffe Van Britis, and it had not been spoken aloud in public in 27 years. His father had been the king of the Holy Nation, a remote island kingdom called Bradis, governed by religious doctrine and succession politics that had turned his birth into a tactical liability. His father's health had declined. Radcliffe, as the primary heir, had become the most convenient target for every faction in the kingdom that stood to lose from a stable succession, so he had been removed from the equation early, extracted under circumstances he would only partially understand for years, and had spent his adult life moving through the world under borrowed faces. He suffered from a condition called mana dementia. His body consumed magical energy constantly, even at rest, a slow, chronic drain that no amount of training could reverse. Custom-made pills kept the loss manageable. Without them, extended magical combat became not a fight, but a countdown, and he had long since learned to factor that timer into every decision he made. He was also, through years of study that no official institution would have approved, capable of using all 10 known magical elements. This he kept hidden. Publicly, he claimed 5. The other 5 stayed buried for situations where hiding them was no longer viable. There was a plan, a large, patient, dangerous plan. 7 ancient relics scattered across the continent. Assembling them was the end point of a structure he had been building for years. Something he intended to use to dismantle what he privately called the cage, the invisible machinery of power that crushed commoners, that turned poor children into test subjects for noble ambitions, that called its own cruelty the natural order of things. He had seen what the cage did to people. The clearest image of it lived behind his ribs somewhere, in a place he refused to examine directly. A boy, young, poor, trusting, who had called him teacher and paid for that trust with his life. The protagonist had arrived too late. He had held the boy. He had then spent the following weeks doing every other thing that could still be done, which meant finding every person responsible and removing them from the world methodically, one after another, in a state of controlled and total quiet. It hadn't brought the boy back. He didn't expect it would. But he had not stopped moving since, and he did not intend to. He also had, somewhere in the city of Letterbell, one person he genuinely trusted. Hans was an old companion, the kind of friendship built on years of proximity and shared trouble rather than sentiment. Hans was already in the city. He had sent word 3 weeks prior. They would find each other when the time was right. Right now, the time was not right for anything except the woman in the uniform who had reached his section of the wreckage. He had boarded the train an hour before the attack, wearing the face of someone else. The disguise was careful. Prosthetic aging applied to his face and hands, white hair, a deliberate stiffening of his posture at the shoulders and hips, the measured gait of joints that had accumulated decades of objections. He carried a cane he did not need. He took a seat in the third-class carriage and appeared to be a retired gentleman watching the landscape, and he was in fact watching nothing of the kind. 2 seats up and across the aisle, a pair of passengers had boarded at the last stop with the particular body tension of people maintaining a performance of ease. A third had come through the far door and taken a position in the luggage section, out of normal sightlines. He noted all 3 and spent the following half hour working out the probable shape of what they intended to do. When they moved, he was already on his feet. The 3 were trained. Their weapons were mana-infused and designed to bypass standard defensive barriers. They worked through the forward carriages quickly, 2 guards restrained, 1 platform connection sealed off, the remaining passengers frozen by the speed of it. They were good. Not exceptional, but good. He let them come to his carriage. What happened when they arrived was not a prolonged fight. The prosthetic face came off. His posture straightened. The age fell away, and he addressed the 3 of them in just under a minute using spells he kept deliberately low signature. Enough output to be final, not enough to produce the identifying magical fingerprint that would have complicated the next hour. He had not fully accounted for the 4th. The 4th was in the luggage section, which he had noted. What he had not fully weighted was the detonation device wired to the 4th's chest, a failsafe for exactly the scenario where 3 trained companions stopped responding. When the 4th registered that his companions were down, he pressed the switch. The blast tore through the middle section of the carriage. A reinforcement barrier snapped up around him from pure reflex, half a heartbeat ahead of the concussive wave, and it held. His ears rang. His bones ached where the shock had transferred through the barrier's surface. Around him, the carriage had become something else entirely. He checked himself first. 3 seconds, systematic, intact. He moved through the debris and pulled the living clear of the worst sections. He did this without being watched, because in the immediate aftermath of an explosion, no one's attention is organized. Then he found the luggage section. He found the body of a young man with travel documents in his jacket. He read them, and then he stood in the drifting ash and made the decision. The woman from the Cold Steel Knights was named Veronica DeVille, and she ran the survivor triage with the brisk competence of someone who had done it before. When she reached him, he was seated against the intact section of remaining wall, the papers held loosely in both hands, his breathing slightly elevated in the specific way of a man processing shock who has not yet fully arrived on the other side of it. She asked for his name. He said he was Ludger Chelsea. She checked the name against her registry. She looked at him. A professional read of his physical details against the description on file. Young, dark hair, male, mid-20s. She marked something on her ledger. She told him transport to the city would be arranged. She moved to the next survivor. He exhaled slowly and looked at the ash on his sleeve. An old knight named Wilford collected him from the station's secondary exit and escorted him through the city toward the Academy grounds. Wilford had the bearing of a man who treated formal escorts as a calling rather than a duty, and he delivered 40 minutes of city history with the confidence of someone who had delivered it many times and improved it slightly each time. The protagonist listened and did not listen simultaneously. Letterbell had the architecture of a city that had once been prosperous, had briefly been magnificent, and was currently managing the distance between those conditions. The upper districts carried the self-assurance of old money. The lower districts, which Wilford mentioned in passing, in the tone reserved for neighborhoods that respectable people traversed rather than stopped in, had a specific worn texture he recognized, the look of places that had learned to sustain themselves without resources and had quietly become expert at it. He noted the slum quarters' position relative to the commercial center. He noted the patrol pattern at the city wall's eastern section. He noted 3 points of entry into the Academy grounds that were not the main gate, including one along the forested slope on the eastern side that was technically within the grounds but too poorly lit to be effectively monitored after dark. Sarin Academy sat on elevated ground above the city. The main building was visible from nearly every district below, which he suspected was not accidental. Institutions that wanted to be taken seriously put their towers where everyone could see them. He climbed the main approach beside Wilford and arrived at the gate with a clear mental map of the grounds already forming. He was going to be extremely busy. Director Elisa Willow was rank 6, and she wore it the way exceptional people wore exceptional things. Not as a display, but as a quality of presence that was simply there whether she intended it or not. She received him in a large, book-lined office with windows overlooking the Academy grounds, and conducted the onboarding interview with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had seen many new faculty members and found most of them unremarkable. She asked about his theoretical framework. She asked about his approach to multi-element instruction. She asked, with institutional warmth that stopped just short of genuine, about his recovery from the incident on the train. He answered everything from the portrait he had built of the real Ludger's academic positions. The answers were correct and consistent. He gave them with the slightly careful precision of a scholar who had been badly shaken and was presenting a composed front because professionalism demanded it. The director looked at him, then the pressure came, a faint, specific sensation, like a hand testing the weight of a locked door from the outside. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Most mages at rank 4 would have felt their composed surface beginning to pull apart under it, the manufactured impression cracking at the seams to reveal whatever was actually underneath. He felt the test. He maintained the surface. She made a note on the paper in front of her. 6 minutes later, she used it again. This time the pressure was heavier. A full application, deliberate and sustained. It pressed against his identity, the way someone might press against a wall to check whether it was load-bearing. It held. She set down her pen. She told him the contract period was 2 years. She slid the document across the desk. He signed it. As he left the office, he was already certain of 2 things. Director Elisa Willow had placed him on a private list of phenomena she intended to understand better, and he could not afford to let her. Whatever the next 2 years required, staying ahead of her specific quality of attention was going to be a constant undercurrent of everything else. He found the hidden materials on his second evening. The real Ludger Chelsea had concealed things in places that seemed secure to someone who had never made a profession of finding things people had hidden. A false back panel in the desk drawer, a sheaf of letters in Quodan, a cipher language associated in underground circles with people who communicated things they could not afford to have discovered. A set of handwritten notes in a personal shorthand. He decoded everything over approximately 3 hours. The true picture was this. The man whose identity he had assumed had not been a fallen noble seeking professional rehabilitation. He had been a constructed persona, built piece by piece over what appeared to be several years, specifically designed to place a Black Dawn Society operative inside Sarin Academy as a professor. The First Order executive who had worn this identity was known within the organization by the codename John Doe. His standing instructions were to surveil a relic stored in the Academy's secure vault, gather intelligence on certain identified student targets, manage 31 other Black Dawn agents already embedded across the faculty and staff, and await orders from the organization's upper hierarchy. 31. He set the letters down and looked at the lamp flame for a long moment. It guttered in a draft from the window. He watched it straighten. He could leave. The perimeter had 3 gaps. He could be out of the city before dawn and begin building a different approach to the relic from somewhere else. He picked the letters up again and read them from the beginning. John Doe's writing had a specific character: cold, composed, dominant without volume. The authority expressed through implication rather than declaration. He read it 3 times, building a model, the rhythm of the man's thinking, the way he structured commands, the particular quality of silence he employed in correspondence to communicate displeasure without explaining it. By the time the lamp needed tending, he had a working portrait. He put out the lamp and went to sleep at a reasonable hour, because operational fatigue was a liability he had eliminated from his practice years ago. The next afternoon, a second-order operative knocked on his office door and gave the correct code phrase. The protagonist let 3 full seconds of silence fall after the man stopped speaking. Not from hesitation. From the same deliberate timing John Doe used in correspondence. The pause that communicates you are being assessed rather than greeted. The operative delivered his full report. 31 agents. Their positions, their current assignments, the status of the vault surveillance, a complication with one of the student targets that required guidance. The man was thorough and increasingly tense, the way subordinates become tense when they cannot read the room. He asked 2 questions. Both were things he genuinely needed to know, and both were phrased to confirm authority rather than reveal any gap in it. He dismissed the operative with a single instruction. The man left. He sat alone, took one of his pills, and swallowed it dry. 31 Black Dawn agents reporting to an identity he had stolen. A director running perception checks on his cover. A relic in the vault connected to his own search. A 2-year contract. And a classroom full of students he was due to face in the morning. The students of Sarin Academy had decided what to think of the new professor before he entered the room. He could read it in the arrangement of their posture, the specific looseness of people who had already concluded something was going to be uninteresting. A fallen noble, new, unknown, arriving under circumstances none of them had fully parsed. The academy had its own social physics, and they had already placed him within it. One student had not done this. She sat in the front right section of the room, back straight, with an expression of deliberate neutrality that meant she was taking notes in her head rather than broadcasting a verdict. Flora Lumos, 2nd year, top test scores in her cohort, illegitimate daughter of one of the Empire's 3 great ducal families. Her file noted an unusual sensory relationship with magic. She perceived it as visible color and sensation, a trait the faculty had documented and then, apparently, done very little with. He set his materials on the desk. He asked the class what the current world record was for casting a rank 3 fire spell from initial activation to detonation. A voice from the back row supplied the answer with the specific inflection of someone who expected this to be the beginning of a familiar lecture. 4.41 seconds. Gerland Institute. 3 years ago. He nodded. He raised his right hand. No incantation. No visible formation of a casting circle. No buildup of magical pressure that the room could feel. One moment his hand was empty. The next, a rank 3 fire spell detonated above the demonstration podium. Clean, controlled, self-contained within the safety parameters of the classroom, and extinguished itself in a single sharp pulse of heat. The wall clock read 0.24 seconds. Every person in the room went still. He let the silence sit long enough to do its work. Then he explained source code, not as a trick and not as a demonstration of personal ability, as a theoretical framework, grounded, precise, and genuinely novel. He described the process of preloading all spell components so the only action required at the moment of casting was the trigger itself. He walked through the underlying magic theory. He addressed the technique's real limits and what level of sustained preparation it required. Flora Lumos had stopped maintaining the neutral expression. She was watching him with something she was actively trying not to show, and he could see her working through the implications in real time. Not the surface spectacle of the record-shattering cast, but the deeper implications of what the framework meant for how magic could be taught and learned. He would not push on that yet. She needed time to process it on her own terms. He penalized a student in the back row who had been recording the demonstration in violation of a classroom policy he had stated at the opening, a policy most of them had not taken seriously. The penalty was measured and public. He then acknowledged a question the student's neighbor had asked earlier, quietly, about the theoretical ceiling of the technique. A sharp question from someone paying attention for the right reasons. The class ended. He gathered his materials, gave the room a single measured nod, and walked out. Behind the closed door, 30 voices started talking at once. He allowed himself the fraction of something that was not quite satisfaction, but sat very close to it. The brief, specific acknowledgement that the first morning of the longest operation of his life had gone correctly. He had a Black Dawn organization reporting to him. A director watching him from the corner of her eye. 30 students revising their first impression. A relic in the Academy vault and 6 more scattered across the continent. A mana illness running its quiet clock inside his chest. None of the people in that classroom knew who they had just been taught by. Not the real name, not the real history, not the full weight of what he carried. Good. That gap was the only thing between him and everything that was coming. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that suited none of the three lives he was now living simultaneously. As a professor, he taught source code theory to students who were still recalibrating their model of what a new faculty member could be. As John Doe, he received reports from Black Dawn operatives, 31 agents embedded across the academy, watching, cataloging, sending him intelligence about vault security rotations and student movements. As himself, which was less a role than a permanent undertow, he studied the vault's access corridors and began mapping what he would eventually need to retrieve from inside it. One of the new professors drew his attention early. Chris Benamor was noble-born, young, and possessed of the specific confidence of someone who had gotten what he wanted from every institution he had passed through. In most respects, he was unremarkable. What was remarkable was the quality of his curiosity, directional, aimed at particular rooms and particular records, not dispersed the way genuine academic interest dispersed. He smiled with precise timing. He asked questions shaped like casual inquiry that functioned as confirmation seeking. After 3 days of observation, the protagonist had a working hypothesis about which Black Dawn order he reported to. He said nothing. He filed it away for later use. The werewolf rumor arrived at the faculty common room on a Tuesday, delivered by a second-year student in a state of managed excitement. Something had been seen near the eastern fence line the previous night. Large, bipedal, not entirely one species or another. Campus security had found claw marks in the soft earth near the tree line. The protagonist listened from across the room and felt a small pull of recognition. He went to the eastern fence that evening. He found the claw marks. He also found, between two old trees at the wood's edge, a smell he recognized from years of close quarters. Hans stepped out of the shadows in a form that was not entirely human. The partial transformation had settled into something between a man and a large, dark-furred creature. Ears set too high, hands slightly too broad, the gait faintly wrong, in a way that most people at distance in poor light would categorize as exactly what the campus rumors described, which was presumably the point. They talked in the cold between the trees. Hans had been in the city for 2 weeks. He delivered his intelligence report in the particular manner of someone who considered himself the least impressive person available for any given task, which was a self-assessment the protagonist had been failing to correct for years. Underground faction maps. Names of people who had been asking around for the protagonist under one alias or another. The rough structure of the city's criminal distribution. The protagonist applied a careful adjustment to Hans's current transformation state, and Hans became fully human again, rubbing his arms with the relief of someone who had been holding a difficult position too long. He rolled his shoulders. He said something self-deprecating about having spent 3 nights making himself look like a monster for the sake of cover. The protagonist told him there was a second werewolf in the area, a real one. Hans stopped rubbing his arms. The real werewolf had a collar. He tracked the creature across 3 nights. It moved with a functional intelligence, not reasoning, but learned behavior, responding to stimuli and returning to specific locations with the consistency of something conditioned rather than choosing. The collar was narrow, functional, the kind of restraint used not to contain something dangerous, but to mark it as belonging to someone. He intercepted it on the 3rd night in an alley near the Academy's service entrance. The fight was deliberate rather than fast, not because the creature exceeded his ability to handle it, but because he needed it contained long enough to confirm what the collar's design told him. He moved it through 2 minutes of rooftop pursuit and dropped a containment field from above, working the angles so that no one watching from the street below could have assembled a coherent account of what had occurred. The collar's fabrication style matched a class of research facility he had encountered before, registered to a licensed operation. He released the field. The creature bolted into the dark. He let it go. 3 days later, Aiden found a small werewolf and its parent in the Academy's eastern woodland. Aiden was a first-year student the protagonist had been watching with careful interest. He carried an anti-magic ability that dissolved active spells on contact, a trait so rare that most published literature treated it as theoretical. Right now, Aiden was standing between his companions and the larger creature with his hands raised in the posture of someone who had decided his body would function as a wall regardless of the math. The protagonist arrived at the tree line and assessed the scene. Both creatures wore collars. The larger one moved in front of the smaller, placing itself between the students and the child. That behavior pattern, the specific protective positioning, was not something a fully converted animal exhibited. He trapped the larger creature in a containment field. It threw itself against the boundary with everything it had, and the intelligence behind that effort was partial but present. The small one made a sound that was not a wolf's sound. Aiden turned to him. He said they might be human. He asked him to stop. The protagonist looked at Aiden. He looked at the creatures. He looked at the collars. He had already confirmed it through Hans's missing persons research. A family. 3 names filed with the municipal office 6 weeks ago. A man, a woman, and their 7-year-old son, matching addresses from the experimental facility's documented subject pool. These were not escaped experiments. They were people who had been used until the data was gathered and then released, because releasing them cost less than disposal. He burned them with a controlled fire application. Both creatures. The parent fought the containment field to the last moment. The child, the small one, looked up at him at the end, and its eyes had something in them that belonged to a boy rather than a wolf, and there was something in that expression that was almost a smile, as if being seen by the person who ended it was its own kind of mercy. He stood with that image for 2 seconds, then he set it alongside the other images he carried, the ones from Delica, from other places where the cage had produced its particular crop, and he filed it where it belonged. He told Aiden to take his friends back to the dormitories. Aiden stayed a moment longer, looking at him with an expression that was not accusation but was not peace either. Then he went. The protagonist stood alone in the quiet wood and checked his pill case out of habit. He had not needed one yet tonight. He put the case back. Hans needed 4 days to strip back the paper. The facility was registered under a holding company with 3 layers between the operation and the man who funded it. Hans peeled each layer with the methodical patience of someone who preferred paperwork to transformations and had gotten very good at it. The name at the foundation was Lord Belfort Rickon, minor noble, old money, the kind of man who attended enough formal dinners to have developed strong opinions about which segments of the population constituted useful raw material. Belfort had written, in his own correspondence, that the subjects were trash. People society had already discarded, made useful at last. The protagonist read that phrase on a Thursday evening while grading source code exercises from his second-year students. He set the exercises aside, read the letter twice, and returned to the exercises. He finished grading them with the same careful attention he had been applying for the previous 40 minutes. He waited until the weekend. The complex sat at the industrial edge of the city, distant enough from the residential districts that its operations read as chemical manufacturing noise. He arrived after dark. Alone. Hans was positioned a quarter-mile back at a communication relay. He entered through the eastern ventilation shaft, having disabled the surveillance swarm 11 minutes prior. The monitoring bees operated at a specific wing frequency, and a precisely calibrated sound wave spell vibrated them apart faster than the security relay could register the loss. He had read the system's specifications in Belfort's stolen files and calibrated the frequency in his faculty office the previous afternoon, between office hours and a Black Dawn report. The facility personnel were trained, but not exceptional. Hired security with magical augmentation, comfortable in numbers, built around the assumption that numbers were the relevant variable. He handled the outer ring in 4 minutes, paralyzing injections from the wrist mechanism for the ones closest to the communication relays, containment and incapacitation for the rest. These people were operational muscle, not the designers of what had been done to that family. He adjusted the level of force accordingly. The insect construct was different. The creature occupied the central production bay, a massive centipede form built from biological and mechanical components, armored at the segment joints, designed to hold a confined space against any attacker foolish enough to come straight at it. Its creator had apparently not considered that the confined space would also constrain it. The fight lasted 9 minutes. He worked the edges, targeting the gaps between the armored plates with precise elemental strikes, building damage in the locations the construct could not reach to defend. When it overextended on the 4th pass, trying to close the gap before he could reset his positioning, he stepped inside its reach and applied an output level he normally kept buried, a compressed burst of genuine high-level magic that left the production bay very quiet and left him with the specific ache behind his sternum that meant he had drawn too deep against the illness. He stood still for 30 seconds. The ache subsided. He moved on. 20 minutes in the facility's record storage. He took everything worth taking and destroyed the rest. Then he walked to the administrative wing. Belafort was in his office. The man had a quality of safety, the kind that comes from standing inside a structure of protection and never having had occasion to discover what lay outside it. He looked at the protagonist entering his locked office, and his face passed through several stages very quickly. The protagonist set the facility's own research logs on the desk. The subject records, the correspondence, the phrase about trash. He let Belafort read his own words. Then he produced the serum, the concentrated formula, the same batch drawn from the documented supply chain in the files sitting on the desk between them. He explained what he was about to do, and he explained it in the plain, quiet voice of someone communicating information rather than making theater. Belafort tried to stand. The protagonist sat him back down with a hand on the shoulder, applied very little force, and administered the injection. He left through the same door he had entered. 3 blocks from the facility, he heard the shouting begin. Hans confirmed via the relay, 40 minutes later, that the factory was burning. The guards were describing a creature that had appeared in the administrative wing and had not responded to any standard security identification. They had not recognized it. They had never been expected to. He closed the file on Belafort Ricken and moved to the next problem. The next problem had a title and a methodical mind behind it. Captain Tina Lyon Hall of the Nightcrawler Order had the investigator's instinct for the question beneath the obvious question. She began connecting the factory fire, the disappearance of Belafort, the Academy werewolf incidents, and the deaths of 30-plus facility personnel within a week of the discovery. She did not have the full picture yet. She was building toward it one verified fact at a time, and the protagonist could see the shape of where her investigation was heading by watching which records she requested from the municipal office. He added her to the roster of things he was monitoring. He continued. A student named Sunita Flunt applied to be his academic assistant shortly after. Quiet manner, sharp eyes, interest in advanced magical theory. He let her in, offered tea, and watched her across the desk while she described her background. She was Third Order, Black Dawn. He had confirmed it before she knocked. Her name had appeared in a report from the Second Order operative as part of the Academy's infiltration structure. Her assignment was to monitor John Doe from close range and flag any irregularities. He told her he would consider the application. He asked her to return tomorrow. After she left, he made a note of her position in the operational map he kept inside his head and moved on to the problem of Chris Benamor, which had sharpened itself into something he could now address directly. Chris had arranged a student duel. A first-year commoner named Aiden against a noble named Javon Felio, with a mana enhancement potion covertly provided to Javon the day before the match, and a significant wager placed against Aiden's odds. The bet had been extended to the new professor through channels Chris apparently considered invisible, framed as a collegial investment opportunity. The protagonist accepted the wager. Chris's expression, held correctly, did not change. Over the following 3 days, the protagonist taught Aiden mobile casting, the displacement of a spell's origin point away from the body's static position, which made a mage's output unpredictable to someone who had been trained to target fixed casting stances. Aiden had the spatial instinct for it. He also had the anti-magic ability, which the protagonist had been considering as a variable since the treeline incident. He built the 3 days of preparation around both. The duel itself took 4 minutes. Aiden moved constantly, casting from positions that Javon's training had not prepared him to read, refusing to stand where the potion-enhanced attacks were aimed. Javon's advantage was numerical, more mana, but mana advantage means nothing applied in the wrong direction. By the 3rd minute, Javon understood what was happening. By the 4th minute, he understood he had lost. He stopped fighting the duel and started fighting the person. The attack from behind was precise and fast, the kind of thing a student learns when they've grown up knowing that losing isn't an outcome their family accepts. Aiden raised one hand. The spell hit his palm and came apart, dissolved at contact as if it had never existed. Aiden turned around, and what he did next was not a magical technique. It was a punch, direct and unhurried, landing on Javon's jaw and concluding the situation with a simplicity that the assembled audience needed a full second to process. Someone in the front section said something short and specific about Javon. The protagonist noted it was not said quietly. In the antechamber afterward, Chris extended the winnings with a smile that had completely decoupled from whatever was happening behind his eyes. The payment included access to a set of research materials Chris had placed in the wager. materials the protagonist strongly suspected belonged to other people's work. He took the monetary portion of the payment. He left the research materials on the table between them. He said simply that building on results he hadn't produced himself was not a methodology he found worthwhile. Chris heard exactly what that implied. Everyone still within earshot heard it. The protagonist put the payment in his jacket pocket and walked out. He did not look back, because he did not need to. The image of Chris Benamor standing with his hand still extended, holding another person's research and a winning smile that had gone completely mechanical, was sufficient to carry without visual confirmation. He built the Owen Group the way he built everything, methodically, from the outside in. The underground of Letterbell had the standard hierarchy of any city that size, a dominant faction holding territory through a combination of actual capability and reputation, a ring of smaller operations surviving in the gaps it left, and a layer beneath those of people who had neither territory nor organization, but performed services that both required. The dominant faction called itself the Red Society. Its leader was a man named Carlo, and Carlo had built his position on the specific kind of reliability that came from eliminating alternatives. The protagonist had been operating in the city's lower districts under a separate identity, a masked intermediary called the Owner, visible only through intermediaries and the outcomes he produced. For 3 weeks before Carlo became aware that something was reorganizing the gaps. By the time Carlo sent a message requesting a meeting, the meeting was already unnecessary. He did not meet Carlo. He let the reorganization continue. The Red Society responded as organizations with territorial monopolies respond to being politely ignored. They escalated. The protagonist escalated back, efficiently and without drama, targeting the parts of the operation that were expensive to replace. By the 4th week, the Red Society had a logistics problem it could not solve, and a growing suspicion that whoever was producing this problem was not going to run out of ideas. He acquired allies during this period, and what he offered them was not money, but something closer to what a person with nothing left to lose actually wanted: the removal of the thing that had taken everything from them. One of those allies had a veil. The woman with the burnt face had been operating a series of small textile businesses in the lower district, legitimate fronts, barely breaking even, kept alive by a quality of product that the distribution system was not designed to reward fairly. She wore a thick veil at all public business dealings. She had worn it for 11 years, since a mage who had contracted with her for design work had decided his payment structure was better served through terror than through negotiation, and had used fire to express that preference. He met her through an intermediary from the reorganized underground and recognized immediately, from the way she positioned herself in the room and the specific economy of her movements, that she had learned to function with the veil as armor rather than concealment. It was not hiding. It was a posture. He was direct with her. He described what he was building. He described the kind of protection and resources it could offer. He said nothing about the veil. On the way out of the building afterward, they were ambushed. Red Society remnants reinforced by hired assassins, Kazalpa by the movement signatures, expensive and professional. He fought alongside her in the stairwell for approximately 6 minutes. She handled herself well in the confined space, read his positioning instinctively, covered the angles he left open. By the time they broke into the open street, he had revised his assessment of her capability upward by a significant margin. He offered to heal the scar. She went very still. He explained what he could do and what the process required. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she removed the veil. He applied the healing carefully. It was not a fast process. She sat across from him in a room above one of her own textile shops while he worked, and she looked at the wall with the expression of someone who had decided to go through with something before they could talk themselves out of it. When it was done, he handed her a mirror. She looked at her own face, straight at it, without the veil in the way, and the expression that followed was not what he had expected. Not relief exactly, something quieter, and more complicated, and more real than relief. She joined Owen that evening. She said the arrangement suited her. He said it suited him. Violetta, she preferred Veta to the formal version, became the operation's legitimate face. The textile businesses expanded. The distribution problem that had been blocking her for years was now being solved by a network that did not consult anyone's permission. The Universal Stone surfaced at a faculty council meeting 3 weeks later. The principal raised it as a security matter requiring current faculty input. The stone, he explained, was a significant relic, one of the oldest confirmed magical artifacts in the Empire's collection, and its transport to the capital for formal study was being planned for the following month. He wanted Professor Chelsea's assessment of the security framework. The protagonist listened to this with the focused attention of someone hearing a problem he needed to solve, because he was. He had already known the stone was in the vault. The Black Dawn surveillance reports mentioned it, but he had not known it was a locator. He had not known, until he traced the principal's briefing materials back to their source, that the universal stone could reveal the positions of other relics to someone who forced it to. He spent the next 4 nights reading everything he could find on the stone's documented properties. On the 5th night, the principal held a demonstration for the faculty. The demonstration was, among other things, a trap. The principal used a convincing replica for the display. The protagonist identified the substitution through a minor material property test applied at close range while appearing to merely examine the stone's casing. The real stone was elsewhere. The principal's intention was to see who attempted to take the replica and use that information to identify whoever had been preparing to access the vault. He did not attempt to take the replica. He tracked the principal to the real stone's location using a tracer he had attached to the man's jacket during the demonstration, a process that required 3 seconds of proximity and produced no magical signature that the principal's defenses were calibrated to detect. He followed the tracer's signal to a sub-basement section of the administrative building and found the stone in a reinforced container that took 11 minutes to access without leaving evidence of the access. He put both hands on the stone and demanded it show him what it knew. The stone had opinions about being demanded of. It pushed back with the particular weight of an ancient object that had not been handled in a long time and did not intend to be helpful about it. He maintained the connection through the resistance, holding the channel open through sheer technical pressure, and paid for that decision with a sustained ache that started in his hands and worked up both arms. 2 relic fragment locations resolved. He memorized them and withdrew. He spent 40 minutes in the sub-basement afterward, steadying his breathing and monitoring his mana levels. The illness made this kind of extended high-output contact expensive. He took 2 pills instead of 1 and waited for the cost to level off. He locked the container behind him. He left no trace that he had been there. He walked back to his faculty house in the dark, made a cup of tea he did not drink, and sat at his desk until the ache subsided. He now knew where 2 pieces of the puzzle were. The next step would require resources he was still building. He added it to the list of things that needed to wait, which was a list he was becoming intimately familiar with. Casey Selmo had been in Letterbell for a week before he identified her. He spotted her first in the academic district, a woman with water blue eyes and the specific quality of stillness that good investigators developed, the kind that reads not as passivity, but as all-directional attention. She was watching the foot traffic outside a registry office with the unhurried focus of someone whose work was knowing what people were doing before they were done doing it. He noted her twice before he cross-referenced her physical description against everything he knew about the people who had been tracking his various identities over the past 3 years. Casey Selmo, private investigator, water magic specialist, rank 4, had been hunting James Morarty specifically, with a patience and a methodology that suggested she was good at it. She had connected 3 separate incidents across 2 cities to a single actor, which was a level of analytical reach that most investigators, official or otherwise, did not achieve. She did not know he was here. She did not know what she was about to walk into. He adjusted several operational details that evening and continued. The Magic Festival arrived and complicated several things at once. It was the Academy's ceremonial centerpiece. Students competing in formal magical duels, professors demonstrating research, the city's wealthy families attending the banquet that closed the week. He had been managing its approach for weeks, primarily because the festival created the kind of concentrated public visibility that was useful for everyone except a man maintaining 3 incompatible identities in one city. He competed in the professor combat duels and won them in the specific accidental way of someone trying to lose quickly and being prevented from doing so by each successive opponent's genuine quality. By the 3rd duel, he had stopped trying to manage the outcomes and simply ended them as fast as possible, which paradoxically created the most spectacular results of the 3. The faculty audience had assembled specific opinions about him by the time he walked out of the arena after the 4th. Devin Boratog was waiting at the door to the final duel. Devin was the nephew of someone connected to the Academy's noble benefactor structure, the kind of person who read vulnerability as leverage and had refined that reading into something he mistook for intelligence. He had, somehow, become aware of the mana dementia. He had taken the protagonist's pill case from the changing room earlier that day. Devin produced the case. He described the terms. A performance in the final duel, publicly managed so that Devin could collect on a separate bet, and the medication came back. The subtext was the public revelation of the illness, if the terms were not accepted. The protagonist looked at Devin for a moment. He walked into the arena. He fought the first portion of the duel at diminished output, because the pills were gone, and the illness was running its clock, and there was no pretending otherwise. Devin watched from the stands with the satisfaction of someone who had correctly identified a pressure point. Then the clock ran to the place where a normal person would have collapsed, and the protagonist chose a direction he had not used publicly before. Light magic, combined with a spatial compression effect that the published literature had no name for, released in a single contained burst that left the opponent safely immobile, and Devin's expression very different from what it had been 30 seconds earlier. The medical team that examined Devin afterward found nothing physically wrong. Nothing that any tool in the Academy's considerable arsenal could identify. They would continue finding nothing for some time. He retrieved his pill case from Devin's personal effects via channels Devin did not know existed. He took one pill. He went to the festival banquet. At the banquet, Duke Lumos ignored Flora. She sat 3 seats from him, his illegitimate daughter, the best student in her year, someone the protagonist had watched carve real understanding out of the theoretical frameworks he had given her over the course of weeks, and the Duke looked through her as if she were furniture that had been placed slightly inconveniently. The legitimate children occupied the seats of honor and performed their lineage for the room. Flora sat straight and looked at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone who had been practicing not looking hurt for a very long time. He crossed the room. He said what needed to be said to the Duke directly, in the measured and public voice of a professor who was prepared to have this conversation in front of everyone present. He described Flora's actual ability level with precision, specific test outcomes, specific theoretical breakthroughs, the gap between what she had demonstrated and what the family's legitimate children had demonstrated in the same period. He did not raise his voice. He did not make it personal. He made it factual, which was more useful and considerably more difficult to dismiss. Duke Katushian, from one of the other great ducal families, attending as an invited guest, weighed in. The math was the math. Duke Lumos heard the math. The Duke did not concede graciously. He conceded the way people concede when the alternative is being visibly wrong in front of an audience that includes their peers. He said, before departing, that the Lumos family did not forget, which was intended as a threat and functioned as a confirmation that he knew he had lost the round. The protagonist returned to his seat. Flora said nothing. He did not require her to say anything. Later in the evening, she found him near the window at the room's edge. She said something short and not quite thanking him, because she was not yet entirely sure how to receive what he had done without it feeling like pity. He said something equally short that made clear it had not been pity. They stood in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had reached an understanding that neither of them needed to annotate. He had noticed Selena Aaron set a silver tray aside near the banquet entrance. He had noticed it because he noticed everything, and because the specific position she chose, slightly outside the natural traffic path, oriented toward the center of the room, was not where a person set a tray they intended to pick up again. She was pink-haired, gentle-voiced, the kind of professor who arrived early to department meetings and brought the good tea. She taught spirit magic. She was, in his estimation, genuinely kind in a way that had not been worn down to performance by the requirements of the institution. He had found her company, in the quiet moments of the faculty common room, to be the closest thing he had to rest. He registered the tray's position and continued through the evening. Near midnight, the tray produced a rank 6 flame entity. The creature filled half the banquet hall in the first 4 seconds of its manifestation. Rank 6 meant something in practical terms. It meant that most of the assembled faculty, combined, were not going to contain it. Guests scattered. Security responded and found their responses inadequate. He was already moving before the first scream finished. He handled the entity through a sustained combination of elemental containment and spatial manipulation. driving it into a progressively smaller operational envelope, cutting off the channels through which it was drawing additional energy from the summoning medium. It took 11 minutes and cost him more than he had intended to spend in a public setting. The entity was finally compressed to a stable containment state and held there until it could be properly sealed. Casey Selmo was in the aftermath, taking notes. Their eyes met across the wreckage of the banquet's decorative rear section. She did not have him yet. He could see her assembling questions. He answered 3 of them with careful honesty and 1 with careful deflection and left, before the sequence could develop further. He understood what the silver tray meant before he slept that night. Selena, Aaron, and Esmeralda, the Black Dawn's first-order flame contractor, whose contact with the Black Dawn's operations he had been tracing for weeks, shared the same body, the same face, the same hands that brought the good tea and arranged the tray. They did not share memories. Each was complete and present in her own context, and entirely unaware of the other's existence. Selena was not Esmeralda concealed beneath a performance. She was simply Selena. Esmeralda was not Selena with a mask. The 2 of them existed in the same person the way 2 rooms exist on the same floor, fully themselves, inaccessible to each other. He sat with this for a long time. The first-order flame contractor, who had been operating within the Black Dawn structure, was not an enemy he could handle the way he handled enemies. Destroying Esmeralda destroyed Selena. There was no surgery available for this problem. He filed it under the category of things that needed time and better information. He went to sleep. He did not arrive at Esmeralda's origin story until much later, through a detour involving a blind painter named Pierre and a village that no longer existed. What Pierre painted, on canvases that held memory in their pigment, was the village of Lotan, a peaceful place, warm by all accounts, burned to the ground because a noble family named Cru Fabius had wanted a spirit contractor who lived there and had decided that wanting something was sufficient justification for taking it. The girl who survived the fire and built herself into a weapon from the grief was Joanna Lovett. The thing Joanna had eventually summoned, a flame demon called Quasimodo, had eaten more of her than she understood, installing itself as the actual first-order executive while she was gradually devoured from the inside. Esmeralda was what Joanna became. Selena was the life Esmeralda had eventually built in place of the one Joanna had lost. He understood all of this in layers, across weeks, and each layer made the final confrontation more expensive to contemplate. The Kunst auction was Hans's assignment, and it went wrong in the specific way that Hans's assignments went wrong, not through incompetence, but through running directly into something that was disproportionate to the preparation. The relic fragment was in the auction inventory. Owen had a retrieval plan in 3 stages. Hans was coordinating the interior team while the protagonist handled the night's other crisis, which was the full manifestation of Quasimodo at the festival grounds. 2 emergencies one night. Hans retrieved the fragment. He was ambushed on the way out by a Black Dawn team that had been waiting, not reacting, but prepared, which meant someone had known. The team was strong. Hans fought 3 minutes with everything he had and was losing, steadily, with the particular quality of losing that a capable person experiences when they've correctly identified that the problem exceeds their ceiling. He drove a wooden dagger through his own hand. The pain broke the partial transformation he'd been holding and released what sat behind it. The beast of Gavalden, the full form, the thing Hans had been terrified of since he was a child and had been suppressing with everything he had, every single day since. It was not a large transformation. Large is the wrong word for something that reconfigures the fundamental terms of the space it occupies. The beast was massive and multi-headed and moved through the auction house the way a fact moves through a conversation. Everything else reorganized around it. The Black Dawn team scattered. Several guests who witnessed what came through the auction house's east wing wall would describe it for years afterward as the thing that destroyed the kingdom of Gavalden 5 years ago, returned, as if it had unfinished work. The protagonist arrived, finished the Quasimodo situation, and came to the auction house. He was the only person present who could make the beast stop. Not because of power, though the icebreaker ship he had summoned to conclude Quasimodo was rank 6 and had cost him significantly. Because Hans, underneath the transformation, was still Hans. And Hans, underneath everything, was listening for one voice. He talked him back. Quietly, without theater, the way you talk someone down from a ledge. Not with argument, but with presence. It took several minutes. The beast became a man again, sitting in the rubble of the auction house's east gallery with one hand wrapped around a wooden dagger he'd driven through his own palm, and the relic fragment still clutched in the other, held through the full transformation without ever releasing it. The fragment was secured. Hans was treated. He refused a great deal of fussing and said several self-deprecating things about what had just happened. The protagonist said nothing that agreed with the self-deprecation. Hans noticed this and was quietly unhappy about being noticed. He returned to the festival grounds and found Selina in the infirmary. She had been unconscious through the worst of it. The moment when Quasimodo fully manifested had required the fragment of Joanna that was still herself to make a choice. And that choice had been Joanna pulling her own soul free of the vessel she had occupied, releasing the demon's hold from the inside, which was the kind of act that goes into a person's history as the most significant thing they ever did and tends to happen in the last seconds of their life. It had not been Selina's last seconds. Because Joanna made the choice, and Pierre said the right things in the right order with the blind painter's particular relationship to memory, and Esmeralda's own soul pulled in the direction it chose. The nun who had raised Joanna in hiding appeared in the moment the way people appear in moments like that, as a presence rather than a form, and the departure was peaceful. The Lotan village dead rested. Quasimodo burned out of existence under the Yesod beam, the divine tree's purification light, which was the most significant spell in the protagonist's actual arsenal, and which he had never used publicly, and which left him in a chair outside the infirmary for 40 minutes afterward, unable to stand. Selina woke with fragments of memories that were not hers, and an expression of someone who had arrived at a door she did not know was in her house. She asked why she had been saved, why he had not simply destroyed the vessel and the threat together. He told her he had made a promise. They were going to the festival next year, both of them. She looked at him the way people look at someone when they understand that a thing has been held onto that could easily have been released, and the fact of it being held onto tells you something you did not previously know. She did not say anything that needed an answer. He stayed until the color came back into her face, then went back to work. The zero-order executive meeting happened inside a dream. The ring he had been given, supposedly by the organization's supreme leader, as acknowledgement of his Quasimodo report, admitted him to the meeting space, a realm accessed through sleep, where 7 first-order executives and the zero-order leader communicated in a formal structure of organized authority and careful implication. Meetings in the Black Dawn's upper hierarchy were not discussions, they were assessments. He attended. He presented himself with the quality of deliberate presence that John Doe's correspondence had taught him to project. He learned names and operational functions. He identified the power dynamics, which executives deferred to which, where the genuine alignments sat versus the performed ones. He also learned that someone named Citadel had been sent to investigate something in the mountains, and then, near the end of the meeting, the intelligence structure report came up. Leaks in the lower organization, suspected interference from an external party. The room's attention sharpened. He named Casey Selmo. Not as an accusation he believed, as a deflection, specific enough to satisfy, documented enough through her actual investigation activity to seem credible, and sufficiently external to the Black Dawn's own structure that it would redirect the inquiry away from anything that pointed toward him. He presented it calmly and in detail, and watched the executive named Nikolai's expression tighten across the table with the controlled irritation of a man who had intended to be the one to land this accusation and had just been used to field another person's chess move. Nikolai would be a problem going forward. He added it to the list. The meeting concluded. He woke up. The silver sun struck 3 of Owen's protected businesses on the same night. Carlo was dead. The protagonist had finalized that problem quietly in the 3rd week of his underground organization's expansion, but organizations like the Red Society did not dissolve when their leaders did. The Silver Sun was what filled the vacuum, faster, younger, more vicious in the specific way of factions that had watched their predecessor lose and decided the lesson was insufficient brutality. They targeted the textile workers Veta had organized, the distribution network Hans had quietly wired into the slum quarters supply lines, and a children's education cooperative that had been running out of a former warehouse for 6 weeks. The education cooperative had children in it. He waited until he had confirmed all 3 were still breathing. Then he went into the dark alone. He had used the pact rarely, not from reluctance exactly, from the understanding that certain tools changed the person who relied on them, and this one more than most. The entity he carried the contract with had been a goddess once, before the things that had been done to her. What she was now was more difficult to name. She manifested as darkness given anatomy, skeletal hands, long-reaching appendages, a hunger that was patient in the way that very old and very wronged things were patient. He offered her the Silver Sun's members one by one, and she collected them, and he moved through the organization's strongholds in the slum district over the course of 4 hours without rest. 112 members. None of them were found. The building stood empty the next morning. The businesses they had targeted reopened. The children went back to the warehouse classroom and found it exactly as they had left it, as if the previous night had simply failed to happen. He returned to the faculty house before dawn. He cleaned the jacket. He replaced the pills he had burned through. He wrote 3 sentences in the operational log and went to sleep. He did not think about the pact until it was necessary to think about it again. He had learned that discipline early. Tina Lyon Hall came to the slum quarter 10 days later in civilian clothes that did not disguise what she was. She moved like an investigator regardless of what she wore, with the particular quality of attention that could not be turned off even when it was trying to blend in. He met her as Oliver. The mask was simple, a broad-brimmed hat, different posture, the accent of the Eastern working districts. Oliver was a mid-level business coordinator with connections to the legitimate commercial network. Plausible, unremarkable, the kind of figure an investigator cataloged and set aside as not her primary target. She asked good questions. He answered the ones that led away from anything useful and deflected the ones that didn't with the specific incomprehension of a man who managed textile shipments and found police interest in his neighborhood puzzling rather than threatening. She noted something about the absence of the Silver Sun's usual activity. He said he hadn't noticed. She looked at him once with an evaluating quality that made him suspect she was better at this than her questions were revealing. Then she thanked Oliver for his time and moved on. He watched her go and made a note to give her more to look at in the wrong direction. She was going to keep coming back. Crow Fabius was living in Sarin under the careful cover of a retired administrator. He had silver hair and the slightly overfed look of a man who had made a career out of other people's suffering and found the retirement comfortable. The protagonist used him as bait for the sealing ritual, the mechanism through which Quasimodo had originally been embedded in the Black Dawn's executive structure, which required a host at a specific location to close. The process required Crew's presence and Crew's terror, and it required doing this without killing him, because the ritual demanded a living anchor. He confronted Crew first. He told the man what had happened to the village. Crew said, with the specific confidence of someone who had never been held accountable, that the village had burned because the mage who lived there was there, and it was the mage's presence that had made everything that followed necessary. He let Crew finish the sentence. Then he used him for the ritual. Crew survived. The protagonist had told him he would, and he had. And Crew spent the following weeks in a very different relationship to his own sense of safety. Pierre left the city after, the blind painter gathering his canvases and his memories, preparing to rebuild alongside Joanna Lovett, whose soul had walked out of Selena's body at peace, and now occupied the space of someone who had been allowed to stop fighting. He said goodbye to Pierre with the particular brevity of a man who found goodbyes awkward and expressed gratitude through things other than saying it. Pierre, who understood this, shook his hand and left. The Valtong Laboratory was the Black Dawn's primary research facility for the pharmaceutical work. The drug formulas that converted human subjects into the creatures documented in Bellefort's files, extended across a larger operational scale and with a more sophisticated methodology. Victor Dreadpool ran it. The protagonist had been assembling Dreadpool's profile for 2 months. A first-order scientist with the cold ambition of a man who had decided that the limits other people placed on acceptable methodology were simply professional conservatism he had outgrown. Dreadpool had a bodyguard named Verome, a night-class fighter with magic reinforcement augmentation, and the facility itself was wired with detection systems that made standard infiltration implausible. He went in through the drainage infrastructure, the laboratory's sub-level connected to the city's sewer network at 3 points. 2 of those points were monitored. The third had been decommissioned from the monitoring grid 18 months ago due to a water pressure incident that had damaged the sensor housing, and the repair request was still in the municipal maintenance queue. He entered through the third point. Verom found him on the second sublevel. The fight was confined, technical, and expensive. Verom's reinforcement magic made him resistant to the kind of precise elemental strikes that ended most confrontations quickly, which meant the engagement required sustained output at a level the illness had opinions about. He managed it by working Verom's rhythm rather than matching his output directly, finding the gaps in the reinforcement's refresh cycle and applying concentrated force in the half-seconds those gaps existed. Verom went down eventually. He did not get back up. Dreadpool used the time the fight bought him to activate the laboratory's containment protocols, armoring his own position with environmental systems while the protagonist was occupied. He emerged into the central research space with 4 automated barrier systems between himself and the primary target, and the specific satisfaction of a man who believed he had prepared correctly. The 8th Cepha was not a spell the protagonist used in situations that allowed for alternatives. The blue flame it produced was not technically flame, it was accumulated magical pressure expressed in a form that happened to look like fire, and what it did to physical matter was not burning so much as a sustained argument against the matter's continued arrangement. Weakened, running below capacity because of the fight with Verom and the illness running its steady drain, it was still sufficient to collapse 4 barrier systems and leave the central research space changed in ways the architecture had not anticipated. Dreadpool survived. He was badly shaken and would have injuries that lasted months. He was also, when the protagonist left, aware that someone had systematically destroyed 2 Black Dawn branches and done it without leaving the kind of evidence that pointed anywhere useful. The research files went out with him. Every formulation, every subject record, every documented experiment. He carried them in a case that fit inside his jacket. He surfaced through the decommissioned drainage point and spent 10 minutes in an alley attending to the cost of the evening before continuing. He told Sunita the truth on a Thursday afternoon. She had been his academy assistant for months, reporting to him, reporting about him, maintaining the fiction of a student learning from a professor, while her actual assignment was to confirm that John Doe was behaving correctly and to flag anything that suggested deviation. She was good at it. She was also, underneath the assignment, the daughter of a nobleman who had chosen not to acknowledge her, carrying the specific quality of someone who had learned to be useful because being loved had proven unavailable. He waited until they were alone in his office. He set down the paper he had been marking. He told her he was not John Doe. She went very still. He told her what he actually was. Not the royal name, not yet, but enough. Not Black Dawn. Not aligned with their objectives. Not interested in the protection of her cover assignment. He told her what Owen was, and what it was doing, and what it had done for the people in the slum quarter who had previously had no one interested in what happened to them. She sat with it. She asked 3 questions. He answered them honestly. She came back the next morning and told him she was in. Not because the alternative was dangerous, she was smart enough to know she had options, but because what he had described was something she had not expected to encounter here, inside an institution that had spent years being very selective about whose futures it invested in. She joined Owen. She remained his academy assistant. The reporting went in different directions from that day forward. His research presentation on mana release theory, a paper on Larzell language applications that had taken 3 months of legitimate academic work woven between everything else, landed in the arcane chamber to an audience that had not expected the new professor's theoretical output to be genuinely novel. It was. He received the kind of recognition that academic institutions extended to people whose work they could not immediately improve upon, which was the most sincere form they produced. He nearly walked directly into Casey Selmo on the way out of the chamber. He altered his route at a 15-second reading of the foot traffic and avoided the encounter. Casey stood at the chamber's east entrance, looking at the corridor he had just vacated, with the expression of someone who had almost seen something they were not sure they had actually seen. She was getting closer. He noted it and kept moving. What she found, 1 week later, was worse for her than catching him would have been. She had acquired a memory-infused object, a technique used in investigative water magic to absorb and replay past events held in material that had witnessed them. The object was connected to him, to the Delica period, to the chain of events that had produced James Morarty from whatever he had been before. She used it alone in a rented room, and what it gave her was not a record but an experience. She saw Delica from inside it. She saw the city as it had been, a kingdom with enough corruption distributed through its military and administrative structure that the corruption had become the structure. She saw the Automaton Project, military officials using civilian subjects, funded by noble money, producing weapons from human beings, and categorizing the process as research. She saw a boy named Art. He was young, 11 years old perhaps, though he was small for it. He helped the protagonist with errands in the market quarter, knowing him as a scholar who asked too many questions and paid well for small assistance. He called him teacher, with the specific ease of a child who had decided a person was trustworthy and had not yet had that decision used against him. He had a sister named Sally. He brought her up often, with the unconscious frequency of someone whose most important relationship was the one they were protecting. She watched Art move through 2 weeks of a city that was quietly building towards something terrible, and she watched the protagonist trying to stop it. Not dramatically, not with the announced heroism of someone who knew how the story ended, but methodically, the way he did everything. Pulling threads, building evidence, looking for the node in the structure where pressure applied correctly could bring the whole operation down. He was not fast enough. The military police came for Art on a Tuesday morning. They came because Art had been asking questions that a smart boy in a corrupt city should not have been asking, because his teacher had been asking similar questions in different rooms and the operation had noticed. They came with the specific institutional confidence of people who believed the people above them would cover the consequences. They were still beating Art when the protagonist arrived. He broke through what was between him and the corridor and he was too late. Not by much, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, but by the only margin that mattered. Art was on the floor. Art was still alive for approximately the next 4 minutes, and what Art did with those minutes was tell the protagonist not to worry about him and ask him to take care of Sally and apologize, in the specific bewildered way of a child who has encountered something that makes no sense, for whatever he had done to cause the problem. He had not done anything. Art never understood that. He died not understanding it, in the arms of the person who had been trying to reach him, with the expression of someone who was still more concerned about his sister than about himself. Casey watched the protagonist's face in those 4 minutes. She watched him hold the boy. She watched what happened to his expression as the 4 minutes ended and Art stopped moving. And then she watched what he did next. He set Art down carefully. He stood up. He began with the military police officers in the corridor and continued through every person in the administrative chain connected to the operation. And he did it with the systematic deliberateness of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply executing the sequence. He was not fast. He was not theatrical. He was thorough. By the time the week was over, the operation had been exposed in the newspapers, the key figures were gone, and the Automaton Project's warehouse was ash. The memory ended. Casey sat in the rented room with the object cold in her hands and looked at the wall for a long time. She had spent 3 years building a case on James Morarty. She had built it on the premise that the person at its center was willing to do terrible things because he valued something less than human life. She had been wrong about the direction. Not about the terrible things, those were real and documented, but about the valuation. She still intended to find him. Her position on that had not changed, but what she had been certain about before the memory was something she could no longer be certain about, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. She put the object in her bag and went back to work. They met at the Valtong sewer entrance 6 days later. She had been tracking the drainage network from a different angle. The same facility, different entry point, the investigator's method of working toward a target from multiple directions and letting the lines converge. He was coming out. She was going in. The timing was poor for both of them. The fight that followed was brief and technically interesting. She was a skilled water mage, and her skill was amplified by 3 years of specifically hunting someone who kept escaping her, which had produced a refined and precise approach. She targeted his movement pathways rather than his position, which was the correct read. What she had not accounted for was the rats. The drainage network in this section of the city was old, and old drainage networks had rats in the quantity that suggested the term habitat rather than infestation. They appeared from the wall gaps when the water magic disturbed the lower channels, and what Casey did when she saw them was not what she did in most situations. Her attention fractured, just for a moment, just long enough. he was already gone. She stood in the drainage tunnel, breathing, and heard his footsteps receding through water that was ankle-deep and cold, and she listened to the silence that followed and said something to herself that the empty tunnel did not relay to him. He emerged 2 blocks away and did not look back. He called the Owen group together in the basement of one of Veda's legitimate warehouses on a Friday night. They were all there, Hans, still moving with the slight, careful quality of someone who had recently reminded his own body of its structural limits. Veda, with the composed attention she brought to everything. Sheridan, who had opinions about the folding chairs and expressed them. Sunita, newest and quietest, positioned near the door, the way someone still deciding how much to trust a room positioned themselves. Arfa stood slightly apart, the automaton's posture precise and still, the soul inside it, Art's soul, given this second form, watching with eyes that held something more than mechanical response. He did not open with a preamble. He said he had something to tell them. He said it mattered, because trust worked both ways, or it did not work. He told them his name, not Ludger Chelsea, not James Morarty, not any of the others. He said his name was Radcliffe Van Brittis, and he said what that name meant. The Holy Nation, the Kingdom of Bradis, the father whose illness had made him a target before he knew what a target was. The room was quiet. Sheridan was the first to speak. She said something characteristically short and direct that amounted to the observation that this changed nothing about what he owed her for the current job, and she expected payment on schedule. It was, coming from Sheridan, approximately equivalent to a declaration of loyalty. Hans looked at him from across the room, with the expression of someone who had suspected something of this scale for years, and was processing the confirmation with the complicated mixture of vindication and sorrow that complicated things produced. He did not say anything immediately. He picked up a pen from the table and turned it between his fingers, which was what Hans did when he was thinking something he was not ready to say. Arfa said the name back. Radcliffe, carefully, with the particular quality of a child learning how a word fits in the mouth, testing whether it changed anything about the person it described. It did not. He was still the same person who had transferred a boy's soul into an automaton body and named him Arfa, so the original name was not the last thing the boy had been called. Teacher was teacher, regardless of what the teacher's name turned out to be. He gave them the rest of what they needed to know. The Holy Nation mobilizing, the succession question still active, what it meant for the next phase of the operation. He answered what they asked and kept none of the relevant information from them. Afterward, when the meeting had ended and most of them had gone, Hans stayed. He sat in one of the folding chairs that Sheridan had complained about and looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said something about how carrying that for this long must have been a specific kind of weight. The protagonist said it had been. He said nothing else about it, but Hans heard the thing underneath the nothing, which was what Hans had always been able to do, and it was why the protagonist had trusted him for as long as he had. 300 miles away, in a dormitory room at Sarin, Renee woke from a dream she could not entirely hold. There had been a cabin in it, a woman, the smell of something warm, and a name, spoken by someone she could not see clearly, spoken the way names were spoken when they mattered, that dissolved the moment she opened her eyes, leaving only the echo of a single syllable, Rad. Something beginning with Rad. A student named Julia Plumhart, who studied dream path magic and had been watching Renee's sleep patterns for reasons she had not yet explained to anyone, sat at her own desk and made a note. She had seen the sealed door inside Renee's dream architecture clearly. Whoever had placed the seal had done it well, with care, with precision, and with the specific texture of someone who had sealed it out of protection rather than control. The seal was beginning to move. In the mountains east of Letterbell, an agent called Citadel found a cave. The cave held what she had come to find, the spirit of a man who had died on a train, several months ago, under circumstances that had been officially recorded as terrorist incident. The spirit of the real John Doe, the real first-order executive, who had spent 3 years building the Ludger Chelsea identity for exactly the purpose it had been stolen for. She asked the spirit the questions she needed answered. The spirit answered them, because the dead do not generally have reasons to lie about their identities. She sat at the cave entrance for some time after. The wind came through the mountain pass in long, cold movements. She considered what she now held, proof that the man running the Academy operation, the man who had given Zero Order the Quasimodo report and attended the executive dream meeting and systematically dismantled 2 Black Dawn branches and made Nikolai look foolish in front of the full First Order, was not who Zero Order believed him to be. She could deliver this information tonight. She had a contact method. The organization would respond rapidly and decisively. She watched the wind move through the pass. Then she put the information in a different category. Not Zero Order's asset, but hers. A piece she would hold until the board reached the position where playing it served her purpose rather than theirs. She stood, closed the cave, and began the walk back down the mountain. The imposter at Sarin Academy did not know what she had found. He would not know, not yet. And by the time he needed to know, she intended to be the one who told him, on her own terms, in the moment it was most useful to her. The mountains held the cold and the quiet, and somewhere below them, in a city full of people who did not know what was coming, a man with no real name and an exiled prince's history was preparing an operation in the capital. Every wall around him was moving closer, the detective who had seen his grief. The royal inquisitors mobilizing in his city, the organization whose identity he had stolen, closing in from the inside, the sealed memories of a woman who was beginning to remember his name. He had operated inside smaller margins. He took his morning pill. He picked up his jacket. He walked out into the day.